Hello and welcome to Unspun Live, the Herald's politics podcast. My name is Andrew Learmonth. I'm the political editor of the Herald. We're giving over today's episode entirely to an interview I carried out with Chris Deerin, the director of the Reform Scotland think tank, or at least he was the director of Reform Scotland think tank. Now he's the director of Enlighten. They've had to rebrand, lose the name they've had since 2008. I'm pretty sure you can probably guess why. But as well as talking about the rebranding, we talked about the state of public discourse in Scotland and the need for more thinking. I spoke to Chris at the end of last week. Here's our interview.
We have been around since 2008.
Yep.
We were formed, so as Reform Scotland, and along came Nigel Farage, and eventually, after UKIP and the Brexit Party and arrived at Reform UK, which wasn't a problem. Mm-hmm. And then obviously they started to rise in the polls. They had a very good general election, ended up with 5 MPs. And as we know from the polls recently, they look like they're going to do quite well next year at the Holyrood election. And we started to find there was confusion arising when we were speaking to people and introducing ourselves. So, my intro would always be Chris Deerin, director of Reform Scotland, the think tank, not the political party. And I think as we became aware that their prospects were actually pretty good, even though we were here first, doesn't matter. Yep. The confusion was there. We're operating in the political world. They're operating in the political world. So with some regret, I have to say, we realised we would have to change our name. And I'd never thought about Reform Scotland as a name before. It existed before I arrived.
Sure. And
I arrived and it was just Reform Scotland. And it was only when we had to change the name I realised what a good name it was, because it was a statement of intent. We want to reform Scotland. And also it just worked as a kind of nomenclature. And so we decided we'd just approach it with enthusiasm and go through the process of thinking, what kind of name do we want to have? We hired an advertising design company, Frame, in Glasgow, who were brilliant, and went through the process with them. And then it's, what should your name be? So there's, we got slides, and it was, British Airways. There's a name that tells you what it does.
Yes.
And then there's something like Orange, the mobile phone company, which if you just saw the word Orange, you wouldn't know what they are. So it's more of a vibes name. Yeah. So what are we? And do you go with a Gaelic name? But I'm a Central Belter. It would have been a bit weird to. Sure. To do that. Do you make something up? Do you do Aberdeen, as opposed to Aberdeen? No, that didn't go well. And I suppose you're sort of thinking, well, we are a Scottish think tank. There's a wee bit of poetry in what we do, maybe as opposed to being a civic or a public sector organisation. So do you replace Reform with something else, Scotland? Yeah. And we went through that process, and it was a bit underwhelming. Yeah. And actually we ended up with the name that we came up with right at the start, which is Enlighten, which obviously references the Scottish Enlightenment, the intellectual flourishing, the pragmatism, the empiricism, the intellectual courage that came then. And, we'd like to think that informs what we do. It also refers to the attempt to shed light on the challenges and the opportunities that Scotland faces. And, we don't have to use the word Scotland.
Sure.
I've always had a thing, I don't know about you, Andrew, but as a journalist, really, and throughout my career, every time you write, you've got to say the Scottish Health Secretary. And I always disliked having to do that. There was almost a cringe factor to it. The Health Secretary, that sort of thing. So the ability to lose the word Scotland completely and just have the word Enlighten, which obviously has a very Scottish reference, and just call ourselves that. And there's a bit of poetry in it. So some people like it, some people won't, but it is what it is. And I do think it's a bit like a band name. Yeah. You come up with the name, but very quickly the name becomes the work. Yeah. So whether you're the Rolling Stones or the Beatles are the worst band name in history. But no one thinks that. They just think of the work that the Beatles do. I'm not comparing us to the Beatles. We're a very small Scottish think tank, but Enlighten will just be the research and the events quite quickly. So we're very enthusiastic and excited about doing it. We did it under some duress, but actually once you get into the process, it becomes a bit of a thrill. You get the chance to rename an organisation very often.
But the press release that you're saying now, it talks about it being more than just a rebranding or a new name. It's sort of a reset almost, is that?
We will continue to do the things that we did before. We're not changing our principles or the way we go about our business. We do research that's very much based on data and evidence. You know, we're non-partisan, we're independent. We produce research that we dig into the data and think, right, here's something that isn't working properly, or here's something that is but could be better. And we think, looking at all of that, here are some ideas that we can propose. So we will continue to do that, fiercely independent, I have to say. And we'll continue, we do a lot of public events, you've been at some of them. So we'll continue to do that. We work with the media a lot, we work with other organisations in Scotland. You know, because we're so small, you need those relationships where you can bring people in to write papers for you, or you can do joint events, or you know, just work on ideas with other people as well, and that's a really rewarding thing. So the reset is really about the name, and I hope the boost that it gives us with something fresh and new to advance with.
You know, I think you sort of talked about, you know, this idea that Scotland maybe needs more ideas, needs more thinking, needs more, you know, challenge. I mean, do you think politics here is too cautious, or do you think it's too comfortable maybe? Or
yeah, no, I do, and I've said that publicly quite a bit. I think the Scottish Parliament, I'm a great supporter of the Scottish Parliament. I was there when it was, you know, when it opened on the opening day and all the rest of it as a political journalist at the time. And I'm a great supporter of the principle of devolution, but I do think that probably the past 25, 26 years now have been something of a missed opportunity at times. I think when you look at our public services, they have not been reformed in the way that they might be. They haven't been modernised. I think a lot of the vested interests in Scotland haven't been challenged. So you might talk about the education system or the NHS. You know, and it's hard to reform these things. They are big, sprawling sectors, and I think one of the things working for a think tank has shown me is how difficult government is. I've had a chance to look under the bonnet, maybe in a way that I didn't as a journalist. You know, you're standing outside chucking rocks at people, but when you're running a think tank, you spend a lot more time with politicians and civil servants and the rest, and they talk to you about what they're trying to do, and it's a bit more of a, you know, an intellectual conversation about policy and that sort of thing. And you see how difficult it is to actually make change. So I'm quite humble about what we try to do and how difficult it is to make those changes. Nevertheless, when you look at the countries that are successful around the world, that's tended to happen because politicians have taken on vested interests. And they've had a sort of view of how the country should be, and a certainty about what they wanted to do. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but they've made change. And I don't think anyone, for example, would look at the Scottish state education system at the moment and think that's working perfectly. You know, a system that was famed throughout the world, and you still hear it sometimes when you meet foreign people. You know, Scottish education system is great, and you're like, well, no, it's not. You know, it works very well for some. It works very well for bright children. But if you know, I think if you're a poor kid in, say, the East End of Glasgow, and you were a poor kid in the East End of Glasgow in 1999, and you're a poor kid in the East End of Glasgow in 2025, have your life prospects been changed by the Scottish Parliament? I think that's a hard argument to make, and it shouldn't be. Because the Scottish Parliament, really, in terms of its two main public sector roles, are the NHS and education, and I don't think they have seized the horns of either of those over the last few decades. And so I think a bit of courage, and that's what we try to do. We try to put out ideas that will deliver a degree of courage or cover for politicians to do things that are a bit more radical, a bit harder to do. And then at the end of that, you hopefully have a policy agenda that will improve the state of the nation for everyone that lives in it.
I mean, do you get the impression that politicians are grateful for that cover? Are therefore then willing to, you know, to take on those vested interests or seize the horns?
Yeah, well, I would love to say that yes, but and sometimes, and it depends on the politician. So when we look at some of the people that have held office, they've kind of gone in and it's felt like they're placeholders. They've gone in, they've had the job, they've managed rather than reformed or improved or whatever. And there are others who've gone in and made a proper difference. You know, we have good relationships with all the parties, and we work with all of them. And our intention is to produce our research and try and persuade politicians of all parties that these are good ideas that are worth taking up and arguing for, and the rest of it. But I do think Holyrood has lacked a bit of courage to take on vested interests. And you know, I remember Tony Blair saying years ago when he was Prime Minister that he had the scars on his back from reforming the public sector. And I don't think there's anyone in Scottish politics of any party that could say that's been in power. And they should be able to say that because you're there to make a difference and to improve the lot of people. You're not there to, let's say, be a placeholder or get in the limo and collect the salary and the decent pension at the end of it.
We're coming up to an election in less than a year now. Do you get the impression that any of the parties are willing to get the scars on their backs?
I think it's changed. I am much more optimistic
that's interesting.
than I was. I've been around a long time now, and I'm still not a cynic. I might be a pessimist occasionally.
Sure, okay.
I'm probably more of an optimist.
Right, okay.
I do think that the sort of Nicola Sturgeon era, if you like, and Nicola had her own view of politics and her own passions, and that's fair enough. But I don't think she took on the challenges that Reform Scotland would argue for in terms of education and health and the economy, wealth creation, boosting entrepreneurs who then provide, good jobs, well-paid jobs, secure jobs, tax revenues that then fund healthy public services. That's what we argue for. But I do think probably one of the best things that's happened has been since she went, and then when Humza Yousaf didn't last very long, John Swinney coming in with Kate Forbes as his deputy, and I think Kate is very pro-business, pro-economic growth, so that's given a kind of push to the Scottish Government. Also the rise of Labour again in Scotland. So Scottish politics became competitive in a way it hadn't been for a long time, and that in a sense forced the SNP to confront maybe the issues that it had avoided for a while. And so you can see that because the First Minister now talks about reforming the NHS. It's his number one priority. They talk about economic growth. I'd like to see them talk more about education. I'm sure they'll get there at some point. And meanwhile, Labour, who certainly maybe until recently felt they had a strong chance of becoming the next Scottish Government, were producing an agenda that was about public sector reform as well. So there's definitely more movement on that stuff. As a think tank, we're more in demand from politicians, policymakers, civil servants than we were, say, 5 years ago. So that gives me hope. A big thing for us over the coming year until the Holyrood election is the manifesto process, and we produce our ideas and argue for the things we believe in. Can we have an impact on that manifesto process so that those ideas have a chance of becoming getting into the manifesto, hopefully becoming legislation, and then making a difference for better or worse, we'd see. But we hope our ideas would make things better. So I'm optimistic that things are better than they've been in terms of the contestability of ideas. But we'll see.
Sure. So in terms of that manifesto process and what you'd like to see in the manifesto, is it things like education reform, NHS reform, and economic growth? Are there specific policies or specific asks you'd like the parties to take on and consider?
Well, there are things Reform Scotland, Enlighten, our new name Enlighten, has been arguing for since we were founded or thereabouts. One of them would be looking at the funding of our universities, for example. In an ideal world, tuition would be free. It currently is free. That doesn't mean students don't leave with a lot of debt. But as we've seen at Dundee, Edinburgh, and various other universities that are in deficit, the funding mechanism doesn't work at the moment. And we've been arguing for a long time that out of a position of just the economic sustainability of our universities, but also fairness to the population, that probably there needs to be some kind of repayment from people that go to university. I don't think the English systems work particularly well. They have their own problems. But we've proposed a sort of graduate repayment where if you graduate, once you start earning above the average Scottish wage, you start some kind of repayment that might be £5,000 or something like that. So you start small and then you can figure it out as you go along. Another example would be directly elected mayors. We've been arguing for those for years, long before Andy Burnham and everyone became fashionable. We're very localist. We do think communities have had a lot of power taken away from them. We can all see that councils are not the force that they once were. If you went out into the street outside us, Andrew, and asked someone to name the leader of Glasgow City Council, I don't think many people would know who that is. Ironically, if you asked them who leads Manchester Council, probably more people would be able to name Andy Burnham because of the profile that he's had and the difference that he's made, the national profile that he's had. And you can see the energy that's been created in Manchester and in Liverpool and in Birmingham and London and places, and they almost act like a lightning rod to allow the community to turn on itself and think about itself. Who are we as a people? What is it we need? What are the faults? We can wander around Glasgow and see the gap sites and the empty shops and the graffiti and the rest of it. So we do think that mayors across Scotland who understand their community, who are directly elected, so they have that direct connection with the electorate, and can be held accountable directly for that, are a good idea. And the Labour Party's picked that up. Not everyone's in favour, but it's an idea that's working in places down south and works across actually the world. You go to most countries and they have some kind of local directly elected mayor, and that works well. So there's that. On education, we produced a paper recently on curriculum for excellence, which we have a thing called the Commission for School Reform. We have a group of very expert educationalists, and they've produced lots of work over the past decade. And we've probably been the sort of main opposition on the education system in Scotland. And curriculum for excellence has not worked. I mean, that's a fact. We can see it in all the data that comes out. You can see it in the international studies. We produced a paper recently talking about the need for a knowledge-based curriculum, which is what we don't have at the moment, which is what most successful education systems around the world have, and that landed with a bit of a thump. I think politicians are starting to realise they're going to have to make some changes there. And then the other thing we're doing, and have been for the last year or so, is a programme called NHS 2048, which is the 100th anniversary of the NHS, which is an attempt to have a debate about the health system in Scotland, which is, as we all know, and your paper covers, day in, day out, is not working as it should. We have all sorts of problems in the NHS. So what are the ideas for fixing that? And we've brought together, ideas, people from every kind of possible corner of the health system. So medics, clinicians, executives, people who work in private, the private sector, working on healthcare, technology, recruitment, retention, training, funding, and a million other things beside. And that's going to be a big thing for us over the coming year. We're going to do a big conference towards the end of the year where we're going to have, I think it'll be one of the big things for the NHS this year, looking at how you get the NHS fit for purpose so that its future is healthier than it looks at the moment.
In the press release, you talk about the role of the media a little bit. You're a journalist, been a journalist for many years. What's your take on where the media is in Scotland right now?
I mean, it's so important. I read every paper every day. It's a habit that was ingrained in me as a young man, and I still do it now. It's interesting to watch what's happened to the media in Scotland. It's obviously not as well resourced as it once was. Newspapers are smaller. Still brilliant people working for them doing a fantastic job, but I know it's a much harder job than it was when I was young, and I worked at The Record and Scotland on Sunday, and we were very well resourced, and there was just rooms full of people, and I know that's not so often the case these days. But the role of the media is just essential in holding politicians to account. The sort of investigative nature of journalism, not taking what they say at face value, digging into the data or the facts, or speaking to people. What do people actually think rather than what they're saying in public? And I think Scotland is quite well served by its mainstream media. There is also, obviously these days, beyond the mainstream media, a whole bunch of either online organisations or individuals that are working hard at that kind of thing. But I still really believe in the mainstream media, professional journalism, because the level of accountability that you're held to as a journalist, the need to fact check, and that you are asked to ensure that what you're doing is of a certain standard, is not always observed in those other areas. So more power to the media.
I mean, as a journalist, particularly you were sort of covering the referendum, independence referendum, you get a lot of abuse online. Do you still get a lot of abuse for the think tank? Is it the same level of abuse, or is it a completely different thing?
Yeah, we get a bit, but that's the nature of politics. I was on Twitter quite energetically in those days, and I'm not anymore. I think lots of us have pulled back a bit. I remember when Twitter was a very fun place and you made lots of friends. And it was great jokes and genuinely enlightening conversations about things. And I think these days it's people with very firm views who've formed into tribes and will immediately jump on anyone that doesn't agree with them, and cancelling people and the rest of it. And that's not really a particularly interesting place to be anymore. I think if you're a serious person, it's quite hard to look at that and think that's worth my time. So
I suppose that's it's part of the environment we're working in now, is where everything is seen as being very partisan or being very particular, aligned to one issue. And you've talked about Enlighten needs to be non-partisan. You said you talked about fiercely non-partisan. Are you able to? How do you do that in this climate? How do you, as a think tank, go about sort of discussing these sort of big ideas without being seen as partisan or labelled as partisan.
Yeah, and you produce your research, and some people will agree with it, and some people won't.
Yeah,
and some people think you're dead wrong, and some people think you have a point.
Yeah,
and we accept that, and every think tank's like that.
Yeah.
But we do genuinely work across the field. We spend time with the SNP, the government, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Conservatives, and others, and talk reform. Well, we're probably going to have to, aren't we? We're all going to have to do that. They've had a big impact on us, obviously, which is why we're doing this interview. But you can't ignore the democratic impetus that is behind reform. You'll have everyone will have their view of reform, but there are people out there who are going to vote for them next year. There are people out there who voted for them last year. And we need to know what they think, because I think there is they're a vibes party at the moment. We look at them and we know that they are anti-immigration, that they're anti-net zero, that they're anti-woke.
Yeah.
So you get that, right? Well, there's some stuff there.
Yeah.
But actually, what is their policy, or what are their policies in education? What are the policies on health and the economy? And we don't actually know that in Scotland. I don't think they necessarily know that yet, but they're going to have to come up with stuff before they put themselves to the people in May next year. So we need to have that conversation with them and treat them seriously, rather than just shouting at them, and also shouting at their voters, because I did think when John Swinney had his anti-reform summit recently, and I know it was more developed than that, and there were a lot of the conversation in the room was a bit more kind of thoughtful than that, but it did send out a message to people that are thinking about voting reform, and I know lots of them, successful business people, ordinary folk. It does send out a message that they're sort of going, you over there, you're a racist, that's not the conversation we need to be having. We need to be interrogating reform in the way that we interrogate the other parties, exposing their weaknesses, listening to their ideas. If there are any there that are worth considering, then we should consider them. And if there are ideas that we need to take down, we should take them down. So we're happy to work across the piece. We've been doing a series of leaders conversations recently. So we did Russell Finlay and Anna Sarwar, and we're doing John Swinney later this year. I want to do Nigel Farage as well. We might end up with protests outside, but we have to talk to the guy and figure out what it is they want to do. Why are people voting for them? There's a reason for that. People are not mad, and they're also representative, as you'll know, of a kind of insurgency populist movement across the West, whether it's the States or Germany or Italy or France or whatever. This is happening across the place, and it's not enough to just denounce it. You've got to find out why people are looking at this and thinking, I might actually support this person, and then explore their ideas and expose the weaknesses. They might have some reasonable thoughts on things. There is the people are rarely wrong. I think that's over a long period as a journalist. And different elections and swings and the rest of it, you realise that there's always a point to what's happening. So
it's interesting. Thomas Kerr, who's probably the most highest profile defector from the Tories, was the leader of the Tory group in Glasgow City Council, and is now Reform's only councillor in Glasgow. He's talked about the scunnered vote, that people are going to them or flocking to them because they're scunnered with everyone else. And I think he's probably onto something there. But why do you think people are scunnered with the mainstream parties?
Well, it's a bit like, you buy a certain type of washing powder and you're not particularly happy with it, so you change your washing powder, and that washing powder is no better than the last one, and you get a bit scunnered with washing powder. Sure. So you can see it in the polls now. At Westminster specifically, there's a Conservative government that had a very disruptive period since Brexit. Really, went through various prime ministers, different types of policy, different approaches, arguing amongst itself, and then in comes Keir Starmer. And people had a lot of hope, I think, especially in Scotland. I think the Labour Party at Westminster has been Scotland's sort of pressure valve for the union. It's, we generally voted Labour, and for a long time always voted Labour, less so now. But they went back to Labour for that election. The Labour Party came in, and people haven't been very impressed. So the scunner factor is there with what's happening at Westminster. There's also a scunner factor in Scotland. The SNP have been in power since 2007. Can you really look at the big, meaty subjects that Holyrood covers and say that those things have got better over that period? Some would argue they have, some would argue they haven't. But I think when you look out at the population and the polls, lots of people have just had enough. There's not a lot of hope out there. And I think politics is about giving hope to people. And it's not just in Scotland, it's also across the UK, and it's also across the West, that there's a dissatisfaction with the traditional way of doing things, the professional politician, the inability to make a difference to life, the cost of living crisis. Can your auntie get treated quickly at hospital? Is your kid being well educated in school? And people, they're not daft, they can see that. They might not pay attention to politics a lot of the time because they're smart and they're too busy. And that would be a nice thing to not have to pay attention to. But they know what's going on, and that reflects in how they cast their vote on polling day.
So Enlighten, you're going to be Enlighten from now on. What would success look for, like Enlighten over the next year?
Yeah, it's a curious thing. I get asked that a lot about think tanks. I spent a long time in London, the Telegraph, running a comment at the Telegraph, and every day I'd be bombarded with new papers from think tanks on the right, think tanks on the left, think tanks in the centre. There'd be events to go to at lunchtime, events to go to at night. And I came back to Scotland in 2014, and it just struck me how limited the ideas conversation was in Scotland, how little debate there was about actual policy, how little progress had been made. We talked about the Constitution endlessly, and we continue to do so. But actually, we weren't making a difference on the things that affect people's day-to-day lives, or not making enough of a difference. I go back to, if you look at 1997, when Tony Blair's government came in, a decent chunk of their manifesto came from ideas from think tanks like Demos and the IPPR. And then if you go to 2010, when there was a change of government and David Cameron came in, Policy Exchange had a huge impact on their manifesto. I think if you go to Holyrood and look at the party manifestos, there isn't really that, you can't draw that line between think tanks in Scotland and what's happened. And I was just aware of the vibrancy of the intellectual debate when I was down south. And I came back, and there was a vibrancy around the constitutional debate, but not much else around other subjects. So when I took the job, my idea was to try and grow Reform Scotland into, because there are a handful of think tanks in Scotland, really, and they're all tiny, and they all struggle to keep the doors open. You've got to raise money just to keep yourself going all the time. It's a big part of my job, big part of the people that run other think tanks' jobs as well. And that's part of it. That's fine. But actually, I wanted to grow Reform Scotland into, in a sense, Scotland's first think tank of some degree of substance in terms of the number of people that work for it, the capacity to produce ideas. Hopefully, in the sort of the rising tide lifts all boats, that we'd have other think tanks disagreeing with us, producing their own ideas. And there are a few of us around, but it's very hard to do what we do. As I say, our budgets are tiny. The ability to produce research is restricted because there are only a small number of us. You have to do a lot with a very little. And so partly it's about then having the biggest impact you can have with the resources that you have. So I think, as I said earlier, we want to have an impact on manifestos. We want our ideas to be out there. We speak to people, we make the arguments, we listen, we talk to people, which way is the wind going on this? Where can, there's no point us producing a paper saying, right, let's have a 20% flat tax, which I remember one think tank doing down south. I mean, one, we wouldn't think that anyway, but two, that's not going to happen in Scotland. It hasn't really happened anywhere. And so with our limited resources, you have to look at where you think you can actually have an impact, where change might be made, which way the politicians are going. And you have your principles, you have your ideas, and then you have to try and advance those. It's a bit like punching a bruise, you keep going, you keep going, you keep going. And I mentioned directly elected mayors. That's a decade we've been arguing for that. And it's only now that that's being talked about in Scotland. University funding, that's going to happen because it can't not happen. It's just not, the situation doesn't work for all the ideological opposition to charging. They're going to have to charge at some point, and otherwise institutions are going to start falling over. And so having that impact on manifestos, trying to not influence in any dodgy way, but just persuade politicians that our ideas are worth considering, and that they might then pick them up, and then hopefully who's ever in government can look at what we do, and there might be bits of it they pick out, it might be a good idea for them. One example would be we produced an idea of having landlines in prison cells for prisoners so they keep in touch with their families, which Hamza Yusuf, when he was Justice Secretary, introduced. And that was great. It was nice to see that directly, and he credited us for it. So it's that, but it's hard going, and it's slow going. And what you're really trying to do is turn the dial a bit at a time. You're not going to produce a paper and it'll be lifted by the government and introduced, and we know that. So it is more about that constant attritional conversation and debate and the rest of it, and just trying to spot where the problems are and produce suggestions that might make it better.
Chris Deerin, Director of Enlighten. That's it for this week's Unspun Live. We'll be back again next week when we'll have a pretty big announcement. You won't want to miss that. You can subscribe to Unspun Live wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, wherever else does podcasts. And we'll be back again next Monday.